On November 6, 2021, the richest man in the world asked the internet a question. Not about rockets, not about electric cars, about whether he should sell some of his own stock. More than 3.5 million people voted. Headlines exploded. Elon Musk is selling billions of dollars worth of Tesla shares. People argued about taxes, politics, the stock market. But almost nobody asked the most interesting question of all. Why did he have to sell anything in the first place? Think about it. If you're worth over $200 billion, why would selling stock even matter? Why not just spend your money? It's a fair question, and it's also one of the biggest misunderstandings about wealth. Because when Forbes says someone is worth $200 billion, most people picture a giant vault, stacks of cash, gold bars, a bank account with so many zeros that the banking app just gives up and says, "Good for you." That's not how billionaire wealth works. In fact, it's not even close. Imagine this. You spend 20 years building a tiny coffee shop. You work every shift, burn countless cups of coffee. Forget what weekends feel like. Eventually, that one coffee shop becomes 10, then 50, then 500. One day, an investor walks in and says, "I'd like to buy your company for $100 billion. Congratulations, you're officially worth $100 billion. But here's the catch. Nobody actually handed you $100 billion. Your bank account didn't suddenly explode. You simply own something that other people believe is worth that much. There's a huge difference. It's the difference between owning a Picasso and having a suitcase full of cash. Both might be worth the same amount. Only one can buy lunch. That's why billionaire wealth feels strange. It's real, but it's trapped. Locked inside companies, shares, businesses, assets, things they own, rather than money they can immediately spend. Which leads to a surprisingly awkward problem. Imagine owning the world's most expensive house and realizing you forgot your wallet before going to dinner. You're technically one of the richest people in town, but the waiter still expects a credit card. That's billionaire wealth in a nutshell. You're incredibly wealthy, without necessarily having unlimited cash available. So naturally, there seems to be an obvious solution. Need money? Sell a few shares. Problem solved. Except for many founders, selling stock isn't solving a problem, it's creating one. And that's where this story gets interesting. Because every share a founder sells can cost them something far more valuable than money. So, why not just sell? If you own a company worth $100 billion, surely selling 1% isn't a big deal. You'd still be ridiculously rich. Right. Well, let's imagine something much smaller. Imagine your grandparents planted an apple tree in their backyard. For years, it barely produced any fruit. You watered it, looked after it, waited. Eventually, it became enormous. Now every autumn, that tree gives you thousands of apples. Enough to feed your family, enough to sell, enough to make money year after year. One afternoon, someone knocks on your door. "I'll give you $1 million for half your tree." At first, that sounds like the easiest decision you'll ever make. $1 million. But then you realize something. The tree isn't finished growing. Every year, it's producing more fruit, more value, more income. Sell half today, and you've permanently given away half of every future harvest. That's exactly how founders think about their companies. To most people, a share is just a number on a stock market. To a founder, it's a tiny piece of something they spent decades building. Every share they sell means owning a little less control, a little less voting power, a little less claim on the future. And sometimes, the future turns out to be far bigger than anyone imagined. Take NVIDIA. A decade ago, it was mainly known for making graphics cards for gamers. Today, it's one of the most valuable companies in the world because of AI. Imagine selling a meaningful stake in that company before the AI boom. Looking back, that cash would probably feel like one of the most expensive paychecks ever earned. But even if a founder is willing to sell, there's another reason they hesitate. Taxes. Let's keep this simple. Imagine you bought a painting for $100,000. Years later, someone offers you $10 million. Sounds amazing. Until tax season arrives. Depending on where you live, part of that profit may be taxed. The same basic idea applies when someone sells stock that has increased dramatically in value. The bigger the gain, the bigger the potential tax bill. Now imagine you're not selling a painting, you're selling billions of dollars worth of stock. Suddenly, that tax bill isn't just expensive, it's enormous. It's a bit like finally winning the lottery, only to discover someone standing beside the prize booth saying, "Congratulations, we'll take our share first." Not exactly the celebration you imagined. So instead of asking, "How do I sell?" many wealthy founders ask a completely different question. Can I get the cash without giving up the asset? And believe it or not, the answer is often yes. In fact, there's one industry that absolutely loves customers like this: banks. Not because billionaires need saving, but because, from the bank's point of view, they might be the safest customers on earth. And once you understand why, you'll never look at a bank loan the same way again. So, why would a bank willingly lend a billionaire $1 billion? At first, it sounds insane. Imagine walking into your local bank and saying, "Hi, I'd like to borrow $1 billion. The meeting would probably end before you finished the sentence. But when someone like Elon Musk walks in, the conversation is completely different. Why? Because the bank isn't looking at how much cash he has. It's looking at what he owns. Let's imagine you own a beach house. It's worth $10 million. It's fully paid off. One day, you need $1 million in cash. Do you sell the entire house? Probably not. Most people would ask the bank for a loan using the house as security. Why? Because the bank knows something important. Even if you can't repay the loan, the house is still there. It's a valuable asset. That asset gives the bank confidence. Now replace the beach house with Tesla shares, or Amazon shares, or Meta shares. That's essentially what's happening. Instead of saying, "I'm selling part of my company," the billionaire says, "I'll temporarily use some of my shares as collateral." Collateral is just a fancy financial word for saying, if I don't pay you back, you have something valuable to fall back on. That's it. No secret loophole, no magic, just security. Think of it like renting a luxury watch. The rental company might ask you to leave a deposit, not because they expect you to steal it, but because they want protection if something goes wrong. Banks think the same way. The difference is, instead of holding a $10,000 watch, they're holding rights tied to billions of dollars in stock. Now here's where it gets interesting. The billionaire receives the cash, but they still own the company. If the business continues to grow, their shares continue to grow with it. Imagine owning an apartment building. You borrow against it. 5 years later, the value of the building doubles. You didn't sell it. You didn't lose ownership. You simply unlocked some of its value while continuing to benefit from its growth. That's exactly the strategy. Not because billionaires love debt, because they hate giving up ownership. And that's a completely different mindset. For most people, money is the goal. For many founders, ownership is the goal. Money is simply a tool. But before this starts sounding like the greatest financial strategy ever invented, there's something very important you need to know. Because this strategy works beautifully, until it doesn't. Imagine your shares are worth $100 billion. A bank lends you $20 billion. Everything looks perfectly safe. Then, the stock market crashes. Your shares lose half their value. Overnight, the bank's safety cushion shrinks dramatically. Suddenly, the phone rings. And trust me, this isn't the kind of phone call you ignore. The bank may ask you to provide more collateral, repay part of the loan, or reduce the amount you've borrowed. It's called a margin call. And despite the polite name, there's nothing polite about it. It's the financial equivalent of your landlord saying, "We need to talk." History is full of investors who borrowed too aggressively. As long as markets kept rising, they looked like geniuses. Then the market turned. Some lost billions. Some lost entire companies. Some were forced to sell the very assets they were trying so hard to keep. That's why borrowing against your wealth isn't a cheat code. It's a balancing act. Powerful when used carefully. Dangerous when pushed too far. And that's the part most headlines never tell you. So, what's the real lesson here? Is it that billionaires have found a secret loophole? Number. Is it that everyone should start borrowing money? Definitely not. In fact, if that's your takeaway, I've done a terrible job explaining it. The real lesson has nothing to do with loans. It has everything to do with how wealthy people think about ownership. Let's imagine two people. The first person earns $100,000 a year. Every month, money arrives. Every month, money leaves. Next year, they do it all again. Now imagine someone else. Instead of relying only on a paycheck, they own an apartment building, or a business, or shares in a company. Those assets continue creating value, whether they're at work, on vacation, or asleep. One person works for money, the other owns things that help money work for them. That's a completely different game. And once you see it, you'll notice it everywhere. Think about some of the wealthiest people in the world. Many of them don't spend decades trying to collect cash. They spend decades collecting ownership. Ownership of companies. Ownership of ideas. Ownership of brands. Ownership of technology. Because ownership doesn't just create wealth, it creates options. The option to invest. The option to wait. The option to grow. And sometimes, the option not to sell. That's why the phrase net worth can be so misleading. When a headline says, Elon Musk lost $20 billion today, it sounds like someone emptied his bank account overnight. That's almost never what happened. Usually, the market simply decided that the shares he owns were worth less than they were yesterday. Tomorrow, they might recover, or they might fall even further. The money was never sitting in cash. It was tied to ownership all along. And that's the biggest lie most of us grow up believing. We think being rich means having lots of money. But for many of the world's wealthiest people, money isn't the prize. Ownership is. Because cash gets spent, ownership has the potential to keep creating value. Of course, there's an important balance. Borrowing against assets isn't risk-free. Holding on to ownership isn't always the right choice. Sometimes founders sell because they want to diversify. Sometimes they sell to invest in new ideas. Sometimes they simply want less risk. The smartest investors don't blindly follow one strategy. They choose the strategy that fits the situation. And maybe that's the bigger lesson. The wealthy don't become wealthy because they know one secret. They become wealthy because they understand the difference between an asset and cash, between spending and owning, between today's money and tomorrow's value. So let's go back to where we started. Remember Elon Musk's Twitter poll? Millions of people were focused on one question. Should he sell his stock? But the more interesting question was always this. Why was selling such a big decision in the first place? Now you know. Because for many billionaires, their greatest asset isn't the cash they have. It's the ownership they're trying to keep. And once you understand that, you'll never look at wealth the same way again. We started this video with a simple question. Why would one of the richest people on earth borrow money? But somewhere along the way, the question changed. Because this was never really about loans. It was about the difference between having money and owning wealth. So maybe the next time someone tells you a billionaire is worth $200 billion, don't ask, how much money do they have? Ask instead, what do they own? Because the answer to that question explains almost everything. The world looks completely different once you know what to look for.